Thank you very much, Daniele, and thank you very much for having me here, for the invitation. I think we all agree it's been a beautiful conference so far, and I've learned a lot over the past 1.5 days. Could we just go to the first slide, please? To the cover slide? No, you need to go to the beginning. This is the middle. So anyway, I can start talking. Maybe to give you a little bit of background where this presentation is coming from. The Coller Pensions Institute is a relatively young initiative. We're part of a foundation based in the UK, and we are a pension action tank. So we aim to bring together research and produce research on pensions, but always with the goal of then working together with governments, pension supervisors, pension regulators, the industry and researchers to create new pension policy to work on pilot schemes that expand pension coverage around the world. And this is really the mission of the Institute. It's to expand pension coverage. And the reason why we believe this is important is because, as we have just heard, and as you know, people are aging everywhere, so pensions are becoming more and more important in people's lives, but also we believe that well-designed pension systems can become a powerful tool for economic development and economic growth. And today I will talk about inequalities in pension coverage in emerging markets and developing economies. So your last slide was actually a very good transition and setup for this with the very interesting partnerships you've outlined in Africa and Asia. And so I will set the scene by talking about aging as a global phenomenon and then take you through very quickly some of the insights of a recent paper that we have published called How Incentives Can Boost Pensions for Informal Sector Workers, and then draw some conclusions. So let me dive right in. So clearly Mirko and I had a similar idea to introduce the topic. Here you see again the share of people aged 65 since 2004 until 2070, but not by region this time, but by country income group. And as you can see, the distribution of elderly across the world is really changing and will significantly change over the next few decades, with especially more and more elderly living in lower middle income countries and a decreasing share of the elderly in what are today high income countries. And you also see that low-income countries, it stays quite low, but it's actually picking up quite a bit starting in a few decades, starting around 2040. So aging is really a global phenomenon. You can also look at it through longevity. And here you see the growth trends. I rebased the values for each country group to their 2000 value. And as you can see, again, the growth this is longevity at 55, and the growth is fastest in middle-income countries. So longevity is really also a subject that this country group needs to address, and I think that deserves more research and more attention. So even though you have these demographic trends that are quite fast and quite strong in middle-income countries and in low-income countries, pension coverage today remains highly unequal. On the left side here, you see pension coverage as a measure of people above the statutory retirement age receiving a pension, any kind of pension. So this can be old age pension, can be tax finance, contributory. And as you can see, in high-income countries, it's extremely high. Also in upper middle-income countries, as soon as you get to lower middle-income countries, the numbers fall off a cliff, with only about 48% in total receiving a pension in lower middle-income countries and around 13% in low-income countries. And you can also see that there's a very strong gender difference in lower middle-income countries and low-income countries, with only around 55% of men receiving a pension, but if you go to women, it becomes even less at 41%. So there's a strong inequality here in these two country groups. Looking at it from the contributor side, so here you have active contributors to a pension as percentage of the labor force in the country groups, and you see a similar pattern. Very high in high-income countries, I would say still high in upper middle-income countries, and then lower middle-income countries and low-income countries. the numbers really fall off a cliff, and again, you have a very strong gender bias, gender lens here. So why is that? Why is pension coverage so unequal and so much lower in lower middle and low income countries? Well, at this point so one main reason behind this difference is informality. At this point in similar presentations, I usually forget to define informality. So this time I did put it on a slide, and we use the definition from the International Labour Organization that informal work is any activity of persons to produce goods or provide services for pay or profit that is in law or in practice not covered by formal arrangements such as commercial laws, procedures to report economic activities, income taxation, etc., etc. And on the right, you have a figure from a recent paper from the Asian Development Bank showing a relationship between the percentage of the population that contributes to a pension scheme and informality in the national labor market. And as you can see, there's clearly a negative relationship across these countries that are all from the region, from the Asian Development Bank. So there is a strong link between pension coverage and informality. Now, is informality actually a big issue globally? It turns out it really is. Here you see informality by gender, again, in these 4 income groups and on the world average. And I think this graph is really striking because, first of all, actually, it tells us that most of the work in the world is informal. Around 60% of total work is carried out in an informal way. For upper middle income countries, it's around the world average. For both genders, there is a gender difference. But then if you go to lower middle and low income countries, it really becomes clear that informality is the main way that people work. It's the dominating group in the labor markets. And you again have a very strong gender difference here with more females working informally than males in both of these country groups, which is not necessarily true for high income and upper middle income countries. But so it really, I think here becomes apparent that pension systems and social security more widely needs to be set up to address the needs of informal workers and need to be set up in the context of high informality. Because something else that this graph tells us is that informality is very persistent. There have been initiatives, many different strategies to try to bring informality down. There's a few countries that have been more successful, but on average, it has been very, very difficult. And economists, I think, haven't really figured out how to bring informality down. And given the demographic trends, waiting for informality to go down to set up pension systems, I think is a very risky strategy. So pension systems need to respond to the fact that informality is a core part of the labor markets in many countries and many regions of the world. This brings me to the challenges for pensions in low and middle income countries. And I just quickly want to outline them because they are very different. A lot of them are very different to the challenges that we have for pension systems in high income countries and some of the challenges we have heard at this conference. So on the labor market side, you have widespread informality. I already talked about that. But you also have irregular incomes. People don't necessarily earn every week, every month. There might be seasonal workers. They might earn for parts of the year. So pension systems also need to be flexible in that regard, flexible in receiving contributions. On the side of the enabling conditions beyond the labor markets, of course, limited social security in general is a major problem. It's not only pension coverage that is limited because it reduces the protection of people against shocks, against short-term and middle-term shocks. And this makes it difficult for people to concentrate on long-term risks, which is longevity. So, for example, protection against health shocks is much lower, against financial shocks, against, of course, periods of violence. So there is more need for short-term financial buffers. And there are some strategies that have combined short-term savings mechanisms and long-term savings mechanisms. Of course, a larger part of the population has a limited ability to save. But again, if you think that 90% in some countries such as Nigeria, 92% of people that are working work informally, it doesn't mean that 92% of people working in the country cannot save. There is a substantial part of the informal worker population in most countries that has some capacity to save. Another challenge are inequality in financial inclusion and financial literacy. You already heard about financial literacy this morning. Of course, financial literacy is also an issue in low and middle income countries. Financial inclusion is something that has been changing, actually, with, for example, widespread use of mobile money. And the digital inclusion combined with the financial inclusion in Africa, Latin America, and Asia has really opened the door for new tools to be used to expand social security and pension coverage. And it's a very exciting field, and you can come up with very creative and a lot of ideas. Fortunately, I don't have the time to walk you through a lot today. But this is really something that has changed the game in terms of potential pension coverage. And then there is a huge underlying enabling conditions, which is trust in institutions, which is important in every single country. Of course, when you talk about long-term savings, who manages the long-term savings? Who are people entrusting their hard-earned savings to? This is a very, very important question. And it's extremely important that the institutions involved in any pension scheme are those trusted by the population. So you need to be very careful there. And let me finish with a set of operational challenges. So these relate again to informality. Because most informal workers don't have an employer in that sense, they don't have pay slips, and they don't have a contract in that sense. Now, if you think about how pension schemes work in high-income countries, a lot of it goes through the employer, a lot of it goes through the tax system, a lot of it goes through pay slips. You know, the monthly contributions are deducted from your monthly pay. The employer needs to transfer them. In the UK, it's the responsibility of the employer to enroll you in an occupational pension scheme. All of these things don't really work if you don't have an employer. So from a purely operational point of view, you need to be creative here. And then there is also limited capacity for governments to enforce social security or pension regulation. And that is why in the definition of the ILO of informality, it says legally or in practice. Because in practice and legal are very, very different if, for example, your capacity to collect taxes as a government is low or lower than in many high-income countries. So you have to deal with all of these things. It's not only a design question, what kind of theoretical pension systems can work, it's also about how will you implement it, given all these challenges. So our overall conclusion is that pension systems for informal sector workers need to respond to their specific needs. Okay, this brings me to some highlights from the paper. So this is a paper called How Incentives Can Boost Pensions for Informal Sector Workers, which is a collaboration between the Coller Pensions Institute and the 3P Global. And the core gap we try to address here is how to expand pension coverage when the traditional employer-employee relationship is not in place. So again, no contracts, no pay slips. And the way we have chosen to address this question is by reviewing pension schemes in 11 countries that have been either specifically targeted at informal sector workers or that are open for informal sector workers in countries with high informality. And as you can see, we have some geographical diversity here, and I'll just walk you through some of the highlights. First, the main takeaways. So very broadly, and I'm happy to continue the discussion afterwards, one crucial takeaway we have from this research is that in terms of financial incentives for pensions, governments need to shift beyond tax relief. We have seen that schemes that mostly rely on tax relief don't really experience any kind of significant take-up. And that also makes sense in a way that most informal workers do not pay income tax or very little income tax. So the proposition of please lock away your money for 30 to 40 years in exchange for some tax rebate is not really attractive if you don't pay a lot of tax. So that's why you need to get more creative on financial incentives. And there's a lot of literature, as many of you know, on the effect of taxes in pensions in high-income countries. And these are very important findings, but they all kind of rest on the basis that you can mandate people to contribute to this system and that people pay taxes. Then tax incentives become, also for voluntary pensions, become interesting. But if that first stage goes away, it's a very different conversation. And I will walk you through examples for matching contributions, bundled insurance, and what we call second-generation auto-enrollment. The second big takeaway is that institutions matter a lot. Trust, regulation, targeting specific groups wherever possible, and also the institutions managing the payment infrastructure are extremely important. You need to think about who should be involved, again, from the lens of the population you want to expand pensions to. Innovation is necessary. I already touched upon this. Leveraging the increasing uses of digital ID across especially low-income countries, making payments as easy as possible, making signing up to voluntary schemes as easy as possible, present very important opportunities. And then, very important that there's no single silver bullet. Every country is different, every population that you will target is different. You need to start by understanding what are the needs of this population, what are the enabling conditions, what are the building blocks you can leverage. Okay, this brings me to 3 examples. The first one is matching contributions. So in the paper we have interesting examples here from Malaysia and Turkey. Here I'm only showing 2 schemes in Malaysia. So on the left you have a scheme for informal sector workers called Isaran that was started in 2010 with a very low matching contribution. So matching contributions, maybe to give a bit of background if you're not so familiar with pension systems, in many high-income countries, people who save for a pension receive a matching contribution either from their employer or from the government. Meaning that if you contribute a certain amount, the employer co-contributes a certain amount. Now again, if you have no employer, who will make this co-contribution? In the case of Malaysia, it's the government. And as you can see, looking at the series of accounts opened, that when they increased the match from 5% of the contribution of the worker to 15%, you start seeing some take-up. And then there were some more reforms on changing the limit of the co-contribution that have really led to an increasing take-up of the scheme. So this is not a randomized controlled trial. This is observation from the country. There is an emerging literature on pension participation in low and middle income countries, and in the paper we discuss it, as well as the literature in high income countries. And the second scheme I want to highlight in Malaysia is one that is specifically targeted at women in low-income households, where there's actually a 50% match from the government, and other people can also contribute to the account of someone. And this is very interesting because it shows that if the digital infrastructure, the government data, digital ID is available in the country, and you can reliably identify people that belong to an underserved groups, such as in this case women in low-income households, you can really concentrate the subsidies on certain groups. The second example is second-generation auto-enrollment. So auto-enrollment, normal auto-enrollment, first-generation auto-enrollment are schemes where, because you start working, you are automatically signed up to an occupational pension. This was, for example, rolled out in the UK on a large scale in 2012. You can say that you don't want to participate, so there is an opt-out, but most people do not do it. Most people just stick with the default. And that has, in the UK, for example, and in other countries, led to a very strong take-up in occupational pensions. And here, what we call second-generation auto-enrollment is auto-enrollment in cases where there is no employer. So you need to look for another entity that can take on this role of the employer, signing up people to a pension scheme. And there's 2 examples in the paper. One is from Kenya, where participants in a youth empowerment program, NYOTA, which has nothing to do with pensions at the beginning, which is more of a labor market program, are automatically enrolled in one of the informal sector pension schemes in the country, and matching contributions are also financed through the program. And another one is Ghana. This is a very new scheme from the Ghana Cocoa Board That is the monopsony institution for the cocoa market in the country. So farmers basically bring the produce to the cocoa board sells the produce, bundles the produce and sells it, and does the negotiation, and then the money gets dispersed to the farmers. And they have just started an auto-enrollment scheme where 5% of the revenue is put into a worker's long-term savings account with a 1% match on top from the cocoa farmer board. It's a bit early to say if this scheme has worked or not, because it only started last year, but it's a very interesting illustration, and I think a very good innovation of showcasing, in some instances, for parts of the informal worker population, auto-enrollment might be a viable strategy. I'll just finish quickly with the last example, which is from Rwanda, which is an example of bundling pensions with other financial products, such as insurance. So this scheme was started in 2018, and it offered three incentives: matching contributions, but also funeral insurance and life insurance. And these benefits were unlocked if people saved a minimum amount per year. And this is very interesting because actually funeral expenses in Rwanda are a major factor in people's financial worries. And this scheme has achieved wide-scale take-up. If you look at the number of accounts open represent among around 75% of those employed in Rwanda, and we are currently working on gathering data on actually how often do people contribute to these accounts. So this is then the number of account opens tells you about coverage, but it doesn't tell you about future adequacy. How often do people actually save, and how much does a single individual save? So there's still work to be done here. This brings me to conclusions, which I will just leave here on the slide. I think one thing I want to highlight just very quickly that I didn't talk so much about is that, I think our work really highlights that expanding pension coverage in emerging and developing economies needs bespoke and innovative solutions, and that taking things that have worked in high-income countries is not enough, because they rely on assumptions that are often simply not true in a lot of other parts of the world. Thank you very much.